to breathe, because it was very dense and I think too many questions and too many issues. Shall we perhaps start with, we are not having a break now, if that's all right. Can we start with questions either from the speakers or from the audience, so that kind of issues become a little bit more clear and more identifiable, because I think now it's a little bit everything is up in the air. No? Yes.
Yeah. Chris, I was really interested. Sorry, thanks. I was really interested in what you were saying about a deep form, especially
deep
with
structure.
Sorry.
Deep structure.
Yeah, deep structure. Sorry. With respect to cities, you mentioned Dubai and Shanghai, where somehow the deep structure perhaps could be said to be in flux, I suppose, from the hypothesis you're proposing. Because, well, some developments in Shanghai, such as the Xintiandi project, do seem to echo in some way the deep structure. Others, like the skyscrapers which you mentioned, seem to be rather imported from other deep structures, almost artificially. So that if the culture of congestion of Manhattan produced, for very pragmatic reasons such as real estate prices, the form of the skyscraper, it just is somehow superimposed into the territory of Pudong, where initially there weren't those high real estate prices. So what then does this kind of incoherent cityscape that's between some kind of skyscraper-oriented one and the old, like, Lilong, or like traditional housing one, is there a coherent deep structure available or accessible here? Or is it, in fact, an indication that the deep structure, which I presume to be some kind of economic or social, cultural structure, when it is in flux, the architectural superstructure will follow it?
Sorry. I think there are a few questions within there, but I think also certain clarification that needs to be made. In the presentation, I think I'm not saying that Kolas or Downtown Athletic Club and looking at the Highrise for Kolas Downtown Athletic Club and the Highrise is to him, to me, in my reading, is the dominant type in which the idea of the city is embodied. Thereby, for him, the idea of the city is the culture of congestion. I think that's a completely different issue than, let's say, what you're beginning to say. The difference, let's say, between the high rises in Shanghai and, let's say, in Pudong, and let's say let's say if I know what you're talking about, Xintiandi by Woodsbaggett, you're saying, yeah, right? In which the type that is being used has more to do with perhaps the reading of the hutong and the reading of traditional courtyard types, right? Now, I think those are two completely separate issues. What I'm trying to say here, especially in the first hypothesis, is that one could begin to understand the city. One could begin to describe and also to theorize the city through its architecture. And for me, it's to use the word architecture means for us the dominant type. And if you see, for instance, the dominant type of the high rise that we see both in Shanghai and Dubai and so on and so forth, is that the high-rise today, and there's a very good article written by Alejandro Zarapolo, in which he begins to describe this high-rise as now having a logic that is completely different from the high-rises that were being thought of in the turn of the century, where high-rises then were meant more, for instance, to deal with the squalor of the industrial city, to increase density, but also actually to free the ground for green spaces. The high-rise that we see today has very, very clear and peculiar parameters that begins to shape its deep structure. Without going too much into Alejandro's high-rise phylum, it's sufficient to say that for us, that deep structure is more productive. We begin to see the deep structure as a structure that gives rise to organization and in which is able to index the social, economic, and political forces to breed these high-rises. Now that is also very different, for instance, looking at the understanding of this deep structure perhaps is also different from, let's say, when I talked about Rossi's deep structure. Rossi's deep structure was more towards the problem of relooking at the possibility of the continuity of the historical city and using the historical city as a point of resistance towards the failure of the city of modern architecture. So I think that they're all very different issues and perhaps not to be clumped together as one. So I would still term that the dominant type that we see in Asia today is the high-rise and the podium. I did not present the podium today, but I think those are the two quintessential dominant type that is driving the growth of cities and urbanization.
Go back to the first two talks, positions. David, you said that at the end, yeah, for you, the new urban politics are kind of metropolitics. Yeah? And in one way, from your position, it seems that metropolitics tend to negate the social forms of either the polis or the urbs. Yeah? And I would like to ask, where would you locate the conditions of social connectivity? For instance, Peter said that for him, these are to be located somehow in the typicalities of situations, if I understood well. Just I would like to pose that question, which kind of cuts through both of these kind of positions.
I think the disappointing answer is that I don't know entirely. I think, and I should emphasise, it's not to suggest that all those other things are negated. You know, we still live in physical proximity in various ways, and that clearly determines all kinds of social relationships. I think, however, those social relationships are increasingly over-determined by other kinds of social relationships, which is much harder to describe in concrete terms. And on that level, I think we need to be wary of a kind of a fetishization of the concrete or the practical as defining the space of the everyday, insofar as I think everyday life itself is suffused by abstraction in all sorts of ways. I mean, what that means in terms of new forms of social collectivity, I suspect that that's kind of politically what we're trying to work out, or there's another way of thinking about what the crisis of the left means or has meant since the 1970s, is that problem of how one reconstitutes a left around those kinds of forms of social abstraction. I mean, figures like Marx in the mid-19th century thought rightly that the metropolis, like the factory, would be a space in which the working class would be brought together, as opposed to the dispersed and fragmented rural peasantry, and would constitute a threat to ruling class structures. Rightly, if we think about the history of urban struggles through the 19th and 20th century. The problem was, of course, that bringing together and therefore the construction of that kind of collectivity also comes into tension with the increasing forms of abstraction, the sheer size of that collectivity also entails. And I think that's what Zimmel sees in the beginning of the 20th century. So on the one hand, cities bring people into proximity on a mass scale in a way that they've never been brought together before, by comparison to the small town or the village or the rural settlement. But at the same time, it subjects those relations to all sorts of forms of abstraction, which pulls, as it were, in another direction. And I think, in some sense, the kind of intensifying problem for leftist politics over the course of the 20th century, and particularly, I think, since the 1970s, 1980s, has been the massive intensification of that second pull, as opposed to the first one, as it were, and how to deal with that, how to find new modes of politics that could operate within those much more abstracted forms of relationality and collectivity. I mean, one obvious ways in which people have tried to answer that, and people like Verneau and Negri and so on would be part of that, would be to do with new technologies, social networking and so on, which I think has some plausibility, though I think plausibility only up to a certain point, and I think there are philosophical problems with the positions that people like Negri and Verneau hold. But I think, yeah, I'm gonna not answer the question in that sense. I'm not sure. I think that is the political issue now, though, and it's not, you know, it's not as if those of us who think of ourselves on the left are doing very well. So, you know, this is what we need to think about, because this may be one reason why we're not doing very well.
Could I ask, it's really a point of, I guess, sort of clarification. I mean, I think my problem is I haven't really understood, like this, what you call this process of abstraction. I mean, I understand, or can imagine understanding, kind of seeing from the 19th century onwards, a growth and intensification of commodification, so that commodification covers more and more objects or arrangements or whatever. And I can imagine, in some sense, that intensifying. My difficulty, and I can even imagine you calling that a sort of the process of commodification, its intensification, a sort of abstraction, in that, you know, one abstract mechanism of exchange is replacing a previous sort of pre-modern heterogeneity of modes of agreement, practicing obedience, whatever, all of which is now a commodity. The bit that I find very difficult is when, as it were, you make the next stage to kind of saying it places the city itself in a way which I'm not quite sure I understood, in a set of more abstract relations, as if then, you know, the relation of the citizen subject to the city itself almost phenomenologically becomes more abstract. And I suppose my question then really is whether that for all that the exchange value side of a commodity, as Marxists would put it, is capable of abstraction, nonetheless, for it to be a commodity, it has also to have what Marx calls a use value.
Yeah.
And the use value is always particular and concrete. One of the problems, in a sense, about the kind of failure of banks in the States is not so much the destruction of value within a certain kind of finance capital, but the fact you've got all this shit housing left, you know, which unfortunately is not abstract, it's all too concrete.
Yeah. Okay. I've been trying to. I was trying to avoid going into too much kind of technicality, and I'll try and carry with that. I mean, you're right. What I'm talking about is primarily about exchange value, and it seems to me that if we think the best way of describing our society, an increasingly global society, is capitalism, you know, is that it is a capitalist society, then that means accepting that it is a society which is governed by exchange value, and that means not only economically but socially, you know, because capital for Marx is first and foremost a social relation, and it's the question of how far that social relation over-determines other kinds of social relations. Yeah. Obviously, what you say about use value is absolutely right, and you're absolutely right about the subprime crisis in relation to that. Although I think that there are a series of tricky issues here. I mean, one is, as I was trying to suggest, in a very sketched fashion around Lefebvre's distinction between abstract space and what he calls absolute or historical space. The more exchange value intensifies, there is a sense in which the less it matters what is exchanged. It pivots around what Lefebvre at one point calls a kind of quasi-void. And in that sense, although of course a use value always has to be cashed out, it's never. It seems to me in terms of something like urban space, it's never stable, which is why, where in earlier spatial systems, a church had to be where a church was, because that was the space it occupied. In a properly capitalist metropolitan space, that's no longer the case. So on the one hand, I live in Bethnal Green, and evangelical churches can set up in a factory, and conversely, a church can become a factory, or more likely a recording studio or a cafe or whatever else. So I think on a very everyday level, that those forms of abstraction affect us in quite concrete ways. Or indeed, I don't want to use it in a sense of vocabulary of effect, because I think it's producing effect suggests there's something kind of concrete that then is abstracting. Whereas I'm suggesting what's unique about capital, what's unique about money, is that it is a production of forms of abstract sociality. Just as one other example, which is essentially how Zimmel understands it, as I think, is in the very simple sense of, so if people like Marx and right through to someone like de Boer writing in the late 60s, the urban is a place of enormous potential political vitality because it brings people together, and therefore it brings together a potentially revolutionary mass, as it were, in a way that isn't possible in the country or in the small town. And it does so primarily in things like the spaces of production, things like new industrial factories in the 19th century. The other side of that, of course, is the increasing abstraction in, again, quite a concrete way of our fundamental relations to other in the exchanges that we have with them. So if I, at the risk of a kind of romantic mythologization of this, because I'm not remotely nostalgic like Marx for this, but if in the country, we know who's making the bread that we're eating because it's us or the guy down the road, we have no idea who is making the bread that we buy in our supermarkets. So in that sense, our relationship to them is very fundamentally and profoundly abstracted. And that I think has all sorts of political consequences, and particularly now in an ever more global field where, the things that we consume are likely to be made in an entirely different country by people we're never going to meet, indeed possibly in a country we're never going to go to. That, I think, raises all sorts of questions for how we think about collectivity. Does that...
Can I just ask a sort of supplement, because it goes to the heart, I think, of what I'm, to be honest, still not understanding how this, I have no problem with all the stuff about abstraction that goes through exchange. It's when it sort of cashes out as a material urban form. Maybe the best way, of just asking a very brief question, when you use at the end that example of the baker, in a pre-modern rural, I knew who the baker was, now we don't. Actually, we sort of do. It's, it's someone called the baker. Actually, we know something about them because, we know roughly what they earn. We know,
really,
given where they...
Do you really think that's true? You really think that most of us know?
No, but I'm trying to make the point, is that our knowledge may not be perceptual. We may not have a concrete perception of them. But actually, and since the city's been going, our knowledge is very rarely perceptual and concrete in that form. It's what you might call semiotic. Now, my point is that if it's semiotic, it's neither abstract nor concrete. It's just semiotic. You know about certain things because you've learnt them in a city. There is a certain system of signs. That's all. It's just that if there is a kind of semiosis of urban experience, and I think there is, then in a sense it's neither abstract nor concrete. It's just semiotic.
I don't know if I can go into much more without just saying I disagree, but I think, in a way, yeah, the point about money itself is that it is both, in a sense, abstract and concrete. But I think that goes beyond semiotics, at least as we normally think about sign systems. I think a semiotic analysis or a sense of the city as a kind of space of signs is more limited in that sense for me than thinking about things in terms of what is a capitalist society, and therefore in terms of those relationships that govern and overdetermine it. But I'd have to go into a lot more detailed discussion with you, I think, to say that further.
But also, I think if we look at what Douglas was saying about the envelope, right? The politics of the envelope, or the deep structure, and the type, the dominant type of the city. I think in this case, if we transfer that into architecture, in this case, I think the level of semiotics is not. I don't think it can explain everything in one way, because when we talk about the semiotic, it's more about the experience of the city in its materiality, yeah? So in one way, I would like to see how, as I said, if we try to move that and to transfer that into architecture, how all these kind of questions could be somehow organized about this idea of either the envelope or the dominant type or the deep structure.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of,
briefly.
Perhaps like to extend that by posing a question to you, Chris, in that, you know, clearly both of ours are very much about architecture and its relation to urbanism or urban form. But I think, and it's because I'm not an architect, that I have a different interest in it. And what I'm primarily concerned with is the city as a space in which the subject is either produced or produces itself and circulates and encounters, and there are different forms of sociality which are produced within that. And I'm wondering where those questions or those issues fit in, if at all, with how you are approaching the city, if we think about it in terms of type and primarily through kind of, you know, what can the city offer to architecture? To frame it in a more simple way, if I'm not getting it wrong, you're looking at what the city can offer to architecture as a form of knowledge. I would ask, well, what could architecture offer to the city? Beyond what's within its own envelope.
I think there are a few questions. There's Marina's question, and also there's Douglas, your question. I think coming back with regards to the dominant type and the deep structure.
It's starting with that now.
I think also coming back to maybe I don't understand fully what Mark is alluding to. I'm just assuming, with regards to semiotics and the city, I think perhaps it points to the question of representation, and I think in the sense that for us, with regards to type and the dominant type, I think what intrigues me is actually these two images, both in London. Both financial center or business district of London, built almost at the same time, plus minus 8 years apart, but both also high rises. But if one were to look closely at its deep structure, it cannot be more different. In Canary Wharf, the high rise is seen as a pure extrusion of an efficient rectangular floor plan. In the City of London, there's no rectangular floor plan. In fact, it's a series of convoluted form in search of novelty, and in a way where the high-rise is seen more as an icon, as opposed to, let's say, the high-rise in Canary Wharf. And I think it's also these two distinctions, the two different ways in which the high-rise appears, the way the high-rise is designed, is produced, says a lot about many things from the point of view of the way the market operates, from the way in which planning is granted, from the way in which context and infrastructure is organized within the city. I can go into this in very detail, but sufficient to say that the deep structure of the dominant type not only represents or manifests itself the idea of the city, but also in terms of its performance is incredibly tied to a highly nuanced way in which the city operates or the way in which the city is thought of.
Maybe I'll try to kind of answer it completely differently. I think a lot of the questions, to me, they kind of dealt with the problem of how real is architecture, or how do we experience it, and how effective is architecture actually to be social or cultural to a degree, right? And I guess the problem is immediately when we look at type and we give an example of it's a high-rise, it's a housing development or whatever it is, it seems on the one hand extremely generic, and on the other side sort of overly sort of specific, right? And I guess that's part of the problem, and I think that's probably something which we haven't really mentioned, which I think is also essential to the idea of type that has to do with, it's of course it's incomplete, it's vague, right? And I think that's of course also the sort of original definition of what type stands for. But I guess that incompleteness at the same time also gives it the potential to become culturally or gain a cultural value. And I guess that also is a potential for it to become what I guess Peter would talk about in terms of typicality, right? Because otherwise we are just talking about something quite generic. And I kind of missed that question because I was outside. But I think that's also something you asked, right? How can we look at the same thing that looks at the same type and still claim it has a kind of differential or a specific value, right? And I think that has to do with it, right? That yes, there is a common structure to it of how we can think about or explore problems that have to do with design. And I think this is probably where we are quite explicit, that we are predominantly interested in the problem of how do we design with it? How do we actually translate those problems that, if they are social, etc. I mean, I guess there's an entirely different question. Is architecture as such ever social? Right? And I think there's a big question mark behind it, right? However, I mean, I do agree that that architecture is specific in terms of how it responds to the cultural condition. And I think this is how we, on that level, try to kind of look at type. And then, of course, there's this entire different level of, which is, I guess, to a certain degree, quite formalistic, right? Or having to do with, what does type also offer as a form of organization that can be explored experimentally and then also then reassessed, right? So I think there are a couple of layers to how you can think about using a typological reasoning and thinking about what is a dominant type.
I think the bigger the more kind of overarching question I'm interested in also, and it goes back to some of your introductory comments, is, can or should architecture, can architecture deal with the city today beyond, looking at a particular type and reproducing that? And I say that because I think it's very interesting that you mentioned in your introduction that the pace of rapid urbanisation outstrips the discipline of planning. So now we have a kind of reconfiguration of these, different disciplines that have made their claims on the city, and that goes back to Lathouri kind of saying, well, planning has outstripped architecture, and it now seems in some way that architecture kind of has an opportunity to get back in there. But then your comments, Ross, seem very much to be about a critique of what happens when it is almost solely architect or an architectural practice who is given, the responsibility for an entire urban development. rather than a number of disciplines coming together in some way to do this. I know this wasn't like the main thing in your, but it was looking at perhaps a symptom of that.
I don't know if I would suggest. Actually, it's funny. A lot of my critique was based on a sort of multidisciplinary approach that's now very popular in urban design firms, and I think it's actually quite ineffective. And in that sense, I don't know if I would say that it's something to blame the architects on. It's more that as a sort of ideological response that architects have, architects being driven by maybe more market-based interests rather than a certain disciplinary affinity or something like that. So I don't know if I would go so far as to talk about the discipline as needing more input from outside or as kind of an autonomous approach necessarily. But yeah. I had a question. I guess I can use my mic. David, it seems you're developing, you're trying to develop a politics, a metropolitics as you call it, through a critique of the city somehow, through a kind of understanding of the city. And I wondered, Chris, and Sam, if your project about understanding architecture as a certain response, or let's say the type that you're interested in looking at, the deep structure, et cetera, it seems to come out of a direct criticism of, let's say, a crisis happening today. I'm wondering if, in your project, there's a kind of potential for architecture itself to go the other way and actually define a politics, or let's say open up a space for politics that does not exist currently, or if you see that potential somehow.
Well, I don't think it ever does, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of slight craziness that architects actually believe they can. And I think that's why, and I think in the end of the day, and I think it comes back to your question, right? I mean, how effective is architecture, and why are we so interested in kind of making it relevant? I think probably a sort of pragmatic answer to that is which you've given yourself, right? Because I mean, I think that's the way it works at the moment. I mean, architecture is being produced at such a rate that if we don't relate it back, I think, to the urban, I think we will lose out, right? And I think it's a missed opportunity. I would not go as far and turn it all the other way around and say, well, look, architecture is actually the thing that forms cultures or forms societies. I don't think it never works like that. I mean, you can prove me wrong on this, but I mean, I think effectively, and I think this is also where probably, I mean, in the 60s when Rossi and that whole gang came back to that whole problem of type, I think they used it also as an opportunity to kind of look at it in a different way, right? And I think that's one of the, I guess, potential flexibilities of type, right? But I mean, having said that, I guess in the end of the day, it's the way you also want to read into it. But I mean, I think in terms of effectiveness, there's very little that can be proven, right? And I think that's also, if we look at the example of the BMW production center, of course you can, make it sound like it's like a mini society, but it isn't, right? And I think it's not really effective. I mean, the worker just works there.
To some extent, because
yeah.
The researchers, the management have chosen to do it that well. They have. The point is that rather than the kind of the notion of getting Zaha because she's a big name, they get her because she's got a history in working with, or Patrick has with working with those problems.
Maybe
through the DRL
right.
here, and I think it must work to some extent.
Of course, I mean, okay, but I think that's probably a different reality.
What I was on about is that architecture, amongst other things, organises social relationships. It organises how people and when people encounter.
Well, it sets up opportunities. Right? I don't think it actually. I mean, it sets up the opportunities for it. I don't think it actually really controls them, right? I mean, I've never really looked at it in detail, but surely also. So they only have one security check. They only have one lobby, right? I mean, could have been somewhere else, right? I mean, I don't know what the rationale is, but I mean, ultimately, yes, I think the functional value of it, in the end of the day, is, I think, limited.
Why the assumption because it's within one envelope, and there's this level of control of CCTV cameras or monitoring or surveillance. I don't know how that necessarily fosters a level of control when it could actually foster a level of conflict, because you have all these different social levels within one room, within one space, and so potentially it could foster a conflict as opposed to this level of control. So right there, it might be tenuous to think about it as architecture being able to control the social.
Well, what I'm talking about is the ambition of it, and the ambition is absolutely to control and to make things run smoothly and to have that. I mean, but yes, of course, there's potential, and I would acknowledge the notion that when people get together in a place just because you've called it a marketplace and it's inside BMW, it's kind of ambitious to kind of imagine that people won't be talking about something outside of work, and that there will be conflict. But I think what I would say there in that particular case, there is a real conflict because the people who are employed there, most of them are employed on temporary contracts. They can be in one day and out the next. And they may all have the same office spaces, but their wage packets are vastly different. Their terms of employment are vastly different. So there is a real social conflict, but that building there is designed to smooth that conflict. It's designed to produce the notion that they are all one community. And absolutely, I think that there would be the potential for that space to be used differently, but in its ambition and the way that the BMW worked with the architects, it is that it operates as a smooth space of encounter rather than one with any kind of friction or conflict within it.
Would you like to say something?
Yes and no. On the one hand, my, as it were, opponents said exactly what I expected them to say, in exactly the way they have said it. I think we don't have enough time to, I think if you can't...
There's a second part.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was happening. I'm not going to have to run, I'm afraid. I suppose my key concern is ethical. And to me, ethics is not something that you can theorize. In this, I agree with Aristotle. It's something you do. It's not something you make. So it's outside of a problem of production, which, when I frame it that way, sounds like it's outside the whole Marxist tradition, even though there's obviously an ethical intent behind it. Though I challenge you to find a good description of even the victims in Marx within his own philosophical framework. It just doesn't exist. And when you get to space and Lefebvre, it's a bloody mess. I mean, he really is confused by it. He's trying to throw concept after concept at it. 3/4 of his historical material is wrong. He thinks space is something that's always existed. He thinks monument is something that you can just, apply to 4,000 years of architectural history, and you just can't. I mean, I would suggest that a lot of the categories that are being thrown around and how you relate ethics to things you very legitimately say about a money economy and the degree to which this gives them something like abstraction, something like a distance, something like, and I don't need to rescue it on the basis of the baker, but what I see in that is the typicalities. There is a kind of role that the baker is playing. And I don't know if the baker is playing a role when you get it in a plastic packet from a machine. God knows what that is. And that is, but on the other hand, we don't get confused. I suppose I'd finish. What so confused Benjamin, an effort to read the Metropolis ethically, was just not a problem for Joyce. And for him, it just wasn't a difficulty that there was a forgotten the word, settling in Israel, earliest forms of a kind of post, Zionism, setting up kibbutz. Thank you. it doesn't matter to him that the kibbutz shows up on a wrapping for butter. You know, what he's capable of seeing the city as built out of its defects, out of things that aren't optimizable. It's built out of its ethical order. And these things have a place, and it's possible for them. You know, he gets European city out of what was then the worst city in Europe. And that's where I would like to be in terms of being able to judge what cities' possibilities are. I think when it comes to something like a dominant type, the implication is that it's something like a lingua franca or a language of a locale. I think that's an issue. But just in terms of vertical urbanism, I think something like Shibuya is much more a vertical urbanism than a collection of high-rises that come to a platform of infrastructure. And perhaps we'd agree, I don't know. But it's the nature of the order of that. I mean, I like Zaha's building for exactly the reasons you do, but I would certainly not see it as a proto-city. If anything, you need to know city before you would identify that as something like city. It's a building that needs the people more than the people need the building. But I mean, all the things you said, I mean, I think it really is an interesting building. Until we have a way of communicating, of communicating about what everybody's calling architecture, what everybody's calling city, in a way that doesn't involve leaping out of our discourse in order to find ethics, will always, there will always be plenty of metaphors. There will always be plenty of models for language, for conflict, for discourse, for, I just don't think a city is a system, for example. I don't think language is a system. And so this is why I say yes and no. I mean, there's I just put it on the table as something to think about.
I think everybody says that it's a bit late. Yeah? You have to go as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think that was very productive. I know we can't give an answer. We cannot give answers, and we are not here probably to give answers, no? More to produce more questions. And as I said, that there will be further events, and also there will be further occasions to sit around the table and discuss, and also all the positions, they will be printed, and we'll have the document for the project review on the 25th of June as kind of as I said, the basis for the next kind of exchanges and debates. I would like to thank all of you for your time, for coming here, for putting forward your thoughts and sharing this with us. And as I say, I look forward to the next event, next debate. So it's not the end, it's just the beginning. I hope so.